Hey everybody, so a while back I made a video all about how to gear drift in Daytona USA, and fairly recently I made a retro review all about Scud Race and talked quite extensively about how the drifting in that game worked. I made reference to the drifting in OutRun 2 several times during that retrospective, and how its slightly on rails type drifting was a lot easier to pick up and get to grips with than Scud Race is. But one thing I think some people still don't really understand with OutRun 2 is how to gear drift, which is performed in a different manner to the game's normal drift mechanic and bears no relation to gear drifting in something like Daytona USA. So I thought I'd put together a very quick mini guide on how to gear drift in OutRun 2. Now, as most of you who are OutRun 2 fans will probably already be aware, the basic drift mechanic in the game goes like this. Just before you reach a sharp corner, quickly take your foot off the accelerator, tap the brake and turn into the corner and get straight back onto the gas to initiate the drift. And then use little left and right correcting motions to keep steering the car through the drift before straightening out as you come out of the corner. If you're traversing a particularly zigzaggy bit of track, usually turning hard in the other direction will spin the car around and keep the drift going. It's an incredibly intuitive and satisfying form of cornering, and it's generally pretty hard to mess up. Although having said that, I've had one non-gamer friend I was trying to teach it to for a 2-player System Link Xbox game of OutRun 2, and he just couldn't get his head around it at all. So why gear drift instead of using the regular brakes? The normal brake initiated drift system in OutRun 2 is a very safe way of getting around corners and is really hard to mess up, as previously mentioned. Gear drifting gets you around the corners a lot faster though, and in some instances can allow you a greater degree of control, but there is a slight risk-reward element to it as well. Let me explain further. To initiate a gear drift, instead of taking your foot off the gas and braking, all you need to do is drop down a gear, turn and immediately shift back up again. You want to be doing this complete set of movements in the space of about a picosecond. When you're playing with manual gears, you get a little extra rev counter on screen next to the tachometer, and when you do a gear drift, you'll usually see it flash red for a split second as you drop down to the lower gear. You will then proceed to drift around the corner at a far higher speed than if you'd used the brakes alone, quite often with barely any loss at all of your top speed. Now, the caveat with doing a gear drift is that you actually need to be going over a certain speed for it to initiate, unlike the brake drift, which you can do at any speed. I tend to find that as long as you're going over 150 miles an hour, the drift will initiate without any problems. If you're going slower than that, the drift won't work, you'll just lose a bit of speed and go flying off the track. So this is where the risk comes in. For example, if you clip a bit of scenery or another vehicle just as you approach a corner, you might end up losing just enough speed that the drift fails and you just go careening off the track. You can still get around this though if you want to initiate a drift at a slightly lower speed using the gears. If you drop down 2 gears instead of 1 and then go back up just by 1, you'll be able to get the gear drift working again, but at a slightly lower speed. If the rev counter starts flashing red indicating that you're over revving and the engine sounds unhappy, simply go back up to top gear. Now, I mentioned earlier that if you want to go around zigzaggy hairpin sections of the track, with a standard drift, all you need to do is steer in the opposite direction as you go from one corner to the next. This will also work with gear drifting as well, but what you might find is that you start drifting too wide around the subsequent corner. The pro way of trying to approach this is to actually try and straighten up as you come out of the first corner and then do another quick gear drift to try and get you around the next bit, which should hopefully prevent your car from drifting out too wide and coming off the track. This is a lot easier said than done though, and is especially tricky at the end of the skyscrapers and shooting stars OutRun 2 SP courses. I quite often just tend to play it safe with a regular brake drift on those. In fact, in the case of the skyscrapers, there's one particularly tricky section where I tend to drop all the way down to 3rd gear and actually just leave it there for a little bit until I've got through the really tight bit. I don't think that's really the right way of doing it, but I haven't found a subsequent way of getting through it without me crashing. The final part of the OutRun 2 scud race tracks is also really difficult for this too. The 5 gear 288 GTO tends to be my car of choice for doing these bonus tracks because it's got really good acceleration. And what I tend to find is for the very final section of the scud race tracks, I drop down into 4th gear and then get round the final couple of hairpins with the 4-3-4 gear drifting method, and then I just keep my fingers crossed that the rubber bandy CPUs don't catch me up right at the checkpoint. It's also worth just mentioning that although there are some slight subtle differences in how the original OutRun 2 handles compared to the later SP versions, specifically in terms of the hard level cars being noticeably a bit heavier and harder to control, the method for gear drifting works the same across all versions. It's also worth just noting that not all corners need to be drifted through. In some instances you can actually just get through them with a slight loss of speed by gently tapping the accelerator pedal, not totally coming off it and leaving the brake alone. So there we go, those are the basics on how to gear drift in OutRun 2. A mechanic that adds a slight extra layer of complexity to the game, but with the benefit of greatly improved overall times. So I hope you guys have found that useful. I have been Mr. Thundering, and I will catch you for another video sometime soon. Cheery ho!